Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This time we're going to talk about a fascinating masterpiece by John Mearsheimer.
Oh, yeah.
The Great Delusion.
It's a good one.
Liberal Dreams and International Realities.
Really throws down the gauntlet.
It does.
When it comes to how the world works. You know what's so fascinating about Mearsheimer?
What's that?
He doesn't shy away from challenging our assumptions about liberalism.
Interesting.
This idea that spreading democracy and free markets leads to a more peaceful world. And he basically says, hold on a minute, let's look at the evidence.
Okay, so let's unpack this now.
Yeah.
Mearsheimer calls this approach liberal hegemony.
Right.
And argues it clashes with the realities of nationalism and realism. Two forces he sees as way more powerful.
Way more powerful.
On the global stage.
Yeah. He's not saying liberalism is inherently bad, but rather that it has its limits, especially when it comes to shaping international relations.
So we got three big isms to grapple with here.
Yeah.
Liberalism, nationalism, and realism. Almost like a political triangle.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer spends a good chunk of the book defining each one and showing how they intertwine and sometimes clash.
Right.
It's crucial to understand them.
He says,
if you really want to make sense of global politics.
All right, so let's start with liberalism.
Sure.
What's Mearsheimer's take? He's not exactly a card-carrying liberal, right?
Well, he acknowledges that liberalism has positive aspects. He talks about individual rights, tolerance, the potential for universal values, all that good stuff.
So where's the but? There's always a but, right?
The but is that he sees two types of liberalism. Modus vivendi and progressive.
Okay.
And he thinks the progressive kind can lead to some serious problems on the world stage.
Modus vivendi. That rings a bell. Is it kind of a live and let live approach?
Spot on. It's all about individual freedoms. Speech, press, property, with a government that mainly protects those freedoms from threats internal or external.
So kind of a hands-off approach, like a referee making sure everyone plays by the rules.
Right.
What about progressive liberalism?
Progressive liberalism takes those same freedoms, but then says, hold on, we need to actively create conditions for equality. It's about positive rights, the right to healthcare, education, things like that, where the government plays a much bigger role in shaping society.
Okay, so we're talking about two very different visions of what a liberal society looks like. And Mearsheimer seems to think the progressive version, while well-intentioned, can get us into trouble when we try to export it.
Right. He argues that in trying to create a world in its own image, a powerful state pursuing progressive liberalism can actually end up causing more conflict than it solves. It ignores some pretty fundamental realities of international politics.
And that's where nationalism comes in.
Exactly. Mearsheimer argues that nationalism is a potent force. Maybe even the driving force in international relations. It's about group loyalty, cultural identity.
And the desire for self-determination? People want to belong to a group. They want to feel proud of their nation, and they want to be in control of their own destiny.
Which kind of flies in the face of this idea of universal values and a global community.
It does. And Mearsheimer points to 6 core features of nationalism. That make it so powerful. There's this sense of oneness. A shared history and culture. A belief in the nation's specialness. A strong attachment to a specific territory. And a fierce commitment to sovereignty.
So we're talking about something pretty deep-seated here. It's not just about waving flags and singing anthems. It's about a profound sense of belonging and identity that can override other considerations.
Exactly. Think about it. How many times have we seen nations fight for independence, resist foreign interference, or cling to their own ways of doing things, even when it clashes with others' ideas of progress or human rights? It's almost like this nationalism thing keeps tripping up those who believe they can just spread democracy and call it a day.
It often does.
But wait, where does realism fit into all of this?
Well,
it sounds kind of like the opposite of liberalism.
Realism, in Mearsheimer's view, is the cold, hard reality of international politics. It's the idea that states, driven by self-interest and a need to survive, are constantly vying for power.
So in a realist world, it's all about looking out for number one. And maybe stepping on a few toes to get what you want. Not exactly a warm and fuzzy picture.
No, it's not. And Here's the kicker.
What's that?
Mearsheimer argues that this realist logic often clashes with the more idealistic principles of liberalism. States, he says, will ultimately prioritize their own security and power over moral ideals, even if it means going against those feel-good notions of spreading democracy or human rights.
Okay, so we've got liberalism bumping up against nationalism.
Right.
Realism lurking in the background. It sounds like a recipe for conflict. Which brings us back to Mearsheimer's big argument.
Yeah.
This pursuit of liberal hegemony, this idea that we can remake the world in our image is actually making things worse.
That's the heart of his argument.
Okay.
He's saying that this approach underestimates both the enduring power of nationalism and the harsh realities of a world where states are constantly jockeying for power and advantage.
So instead of creating a more peaceful world, we're actually making it more unstable and dangerous.
That's what Mearsheimer contends. He points to historical examples, like the U.S. interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, places where attempts to impose democracy from the outside backfired spectacularly.
So he's saying that these interventions, while maybe well-intentioned, ultimately created more chaos and resentment than they solved.
Yeah.
Kind of like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. He argues that these interventions ignored the deep-seated nationalist sentiments in those countries, the desire for self-determination, the resistance to outside interference.
And he also points to the expansion of NATO, right? This idea that bringing more countries into the Western fold would create stability and security.
Right. Mearsheimer sees that as another example of liberal hegemony. Pushing up against the realities of nationalism and realism.
Right.
He argues that expanding NATO eastward, instead of making Russia feel more secure, actually made them feel threatened, contributing to the current tensions we see.
So it's like we're trying to export this system that we think is great.
Right.
But we're not really considering how it might be perceived or received by those on the receiving end. And we're ignoring those powerful forces of nationalism and realism that Mearsheimer keeps emphasizing.
Exactly. And this leads to a really crucial question.
Okay.
If Mearsheimer's right, if this pursuit of liberal hegemony is actually counterproductive, then what's the alternative?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
He must have some ideas about how we should be approaching the world. Right. What does Mearsheimer suggest as a better path forward?
Well,
I guess we'll have to wait and see.
He's all about a more restrained foreign policy. You know, one that ditches those lofty goals of remaking the world.
Right.
And instead focuses on a realistic assessment of national interests.
So less about spreading democracy. And more about protecting our own backyard, so to speak.
Exactly.
Kind of a mind-your-own-business approach to foreign policy.
You could say that he argues that the U.S. should focus on maintaining its own security and prosperity. And avoid getting entangled in conflicts that don't directly threaten those core interests.
I see.
He's particularly wary of trying to impose democracy by force.
It almost sounds like he's saying, let's not try to be the world's policeman, which is a pretty big departure from how U.S. foreign policy has often been conducted, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. He's challenging a deeply ingrained mindset. This idea that America has a special mission to spread its values around the globe. Mearsheimer's pushing back against that, arguing for a more humble and pragmatic approach.
So less intervention, more focus on core interests. What else does he suggest? Does he have any faith in those big international institutions?
Like
the UN or the World Trade Organization?
He's pretty skeptical about their ability to truly constrain state behavior. He sees states as ultimately driven by their own interests. And those interests will often clash. Regardless of what international agreements say, he doesn't completely dismiss these institutions, but he certainly doesn't see them as a solution to the problem of conflict.
So even with all the talk of globalization and interdependence, he still thinks power politics is the name of the game. Kind of a might makes right worldview.
In a way, yes. He believes that in an anarchic world, with no overarching authority to enforce rules, states will always be looking out for themselves, first and foremost. And that means acquiring and wielding power to protect their interests.
I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Mearsheimer sees this clash between idealism and realism, with liberalism often on the losing end. And he thinks we need a foreign policy that's more grounded in the realities of power politics, less focus on these ambitious goals of spreading democracy.
That's a great summary. But there's another layer to his argument that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay.
He digs into human nature itself.
Oh.
And argues that our inherent social tendencies make us prone to conflict.
That's interesting. I always thought liberalism was about celebrating the individual, empowering people to make their own choices. How does that square with this idea that we're hardwired for conflict?
Well, Mearsheimer acknowledges the individualistic aspect of liberalism.
Okay.
But he argues that it underestimates the power of our social nature. Our tendency to form groups and identify with them strongly. We're not just rational individuals floating around, he says. We're deeply embedded in social structures.
Okay.
And those structures shape our beliefs and behaviors in profound ways.
So even in a liberal society, we're still susceptible to this us versus them mentality. That doesn't sound very hopeful.
He's not saying we're doomed to conflict.
Okay.
But he's arguing that we need to be realistic about these deep-seated tendencies.
Okay.
And he thinks this has huge implications for how we approach foreign policy.
I see what you mean. If we're wired to form groups and identify with them strongly,
right,
then it makes sense that nationalism would be such a powerful force. We're drawn to that sense of belonging, that shared identity, even if it leads to conflict with other groups.
Exactly. And realism, with its focus on state power and competition, recognizes this group dynamic as well. States, after all, are essentially competing groups on a larger scale.
Okay, so if we're hardwired for conflict, and if the pursuit of liberal hegemony is actually making things worse, as Mearsheimer argues, then what hope is there for a more peaceful world? It sounds pretty bleak, to be honest.
It's not necessarily about finding a magic formula for world peace.
Okay.
I think Mearsheimer would say that's a naive goal.
Right.
He's more about managing conflict.
Okay.
Finding ways to prevent it from escalating into catastrophic wars.
So it's about being realistic about what we can achieve.
Exactly.
Recognizing the limits of our power and the enduring force of nationalism.
Exactly. It's about being more cautious and selective in our interventions. Focusing on diplomacy and deterrence, and understanding that we can't force other nations to adopt our values or systems. It's a more humble and restrained approach to foreign policy.
Okay.
One that recognizes the complexities of a world where different nations have different interests and priorities.
So we've explored Mearsheimer's take on liberalism, nationalism, and realism. We've looked at his critique of liberal hegemony and his argument for a more restrained foreign policy. But it's important to remember that his views are not universally shared, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, surely there are people who disagree with his assessment.
His book has been incredibly influential. But it's also sparked a ton of debate among scholars of international relations. Some people argue that he's too pessimistic, that he underestimates the potential for cooperation and the positive impact of things like democracy and international institutions.
So there are other experts who believe that liberalism, despite its flaws, can actually make a positive contribution to global peace and stability. That we shouldn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Exactly. They point to the fact that democracies rarely fight each other. That international law has made some progress in restraining state behavior. And that economic interdependence has made war more costly and therefore less likely.
Right.
They acknowledge the limitations of liberalism, but argue that it's still a force for good in the world.
So there's a whole spectrum of opinions out there.
There is.
From die-hard realists like Mearsheimer to those who believe in the power of liberal institutions and norms to promote peace. It's not a simple black and white issue. There are valid arguments on both sides.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating.
I agree.
It challenges us to think critically about our own assumptions, to weigh the evidence, and to consider different perspectives. It's not about finding the right answer, but rather about engaging in a thoughtful and nuanced debate about how best to navigate the complexities of international relations.
And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive, right?
Exactly.
To go beyond the headlines and sound bites, to really delve into the ideas that shape our world. And even if we don't come away with all the answers, hopefully we come away with a better understanding of the questions. What are some key criticisms of Mearsheimer's arguments? And what alternative perspectives should we consider?
One thing that really struck me about his book, was this tension he sees between liberalism and nationalism.
It's like they're two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
Constantly pushing and pulling against each other.
Mearsheimer argues that this tension is built into the DNA of liberal states.
I see.
On the one hand, you have this commitment to individual rights and universal values. This idea that everyone deserves equal treatment and opportunity regardless of their background.
Right. It's like that famous line from the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly.
All men are created equal. That's the bedrock of liberalism.
Exactly.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have this powerful force of nationalism,
Right.
which emphasizes group loyalty, cultural identity,
Right.
and a strong sense of belonging to a particular nation.
Mm.
And these two impulses can sometimes clash pretty dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just think about the debates we have about immigration.
Oh, yeah.
A purely liberal approach might suggest open borders.
Oh.
Welcoming everyone who wants to come in.
Right.
But then you run up against those nationalist concerns about protecting national identity, preserving cultural traditions, and ensuring the economic well-being of existing citizens.
It's a classic dilemma, and it's not just about immigration. You see this tension playing out in all sorts of areas, like trade policy, foreign intervention, even social welfare programs.
You know, it makes me think about the debate about globalization. From a purely liberal perspective, free trade and open markets sound great.
Sure.
It's all about maximizing economic efficiency and lifting people out of poverty.
Right.
But then you have those nationalist critiques about jobs being outsourced, local industries being decimated, and a sense that global forces are eroding national sovereignty.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of military intervention.
Right.
A liberal might argue that we have a moral obligation to intervene in another country to prevent genocide or human rights abuses, or to promote democracy. But a nationalist might be much more hesitant to get involved in foreign conflicts, arguing that we should prioritize our own interests and avoid getting bogged down in messy entanglements overseas.
It seems like this tension between liberalism and nationalism is constantly bubbling beneath the surface of our political debates, both domestically and internationally. It's like this tug-of-war between our desire for a more just and equitable world and our deep-seated attachments to our own nations and communities.
I think that's one of the key insights that Mearsheimer offers. That we need to be more aware of this tension and its implications for how we approach the world. He's not saying that liberalism is bad or that nationalism is always dangerous, but rather that we need to recognize their inherent limitations and find ways to balance these competing impulses.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go out into the world armed with these insights from Mearsheimer?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is to be wary of simplistic solutions. You know, there's a tendency, especially in the West, to think that we can just export our values and systems to other countries and everything will work out fine. Mearsheimer is urging us to be more realistic about the complexities of the world, the limits of our power, and the enduring force of nationalism.
It's a call for humility in a way, a reminder that our way isn't always the best way, and that imposing our will on others can often backfire.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that other nations have their own legitimate interests and priorities.
Right.
And that finding common ground requires dialogue, compromise, and a willingness to listen to different perspectives. It's not about abandoning our values, but about being more strategic and realistic about how we promote them.
So maybe it's less about spreading democracy and more about creating conditions where democracy can flourish organically, based on the unique circumstances and desires of each nation.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about empowering people, not imposing our will.
Okay.
And it's about understanding that real progress takes time, patience, and a deep respect for the complexities of different cultures and societies.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the core tenets of liberalism, nationalism, and realism, to Mearsheimer's critiques of liberal hegemony and his argument for a more restrained foreign policy. And we've explored how all of this plays out in the real world, from the debates about immigration and globalization to the challenges of navigating international relations in a multipolar world.
It's a lot to process, for sure, but I think Mearsheimer's work offers a valuable framework for understanding some of the most pressing issues of our time. It challenges us to think critically, question assumptions, and engage in constructive dialogue about the best way forward.
It's definitely a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it. And for those who want to explore these ideas further, we highly recommend checking out The Great Delusion for themselves.
That's a good one.
It's a dense read, but it's well worth the effort.
Absolutely. It's a book that will make you think, make you question, and maybe even make you a little bit uncomfortable.
Right.
But isn't that what great books are supposed to do?
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. As always, thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep diving deep.